Imagine being 17 years old, scared, and completely alone. You're carrying a secret that feels too heavy to bear. And instead of finding comfort in the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, they turn their backs on you. That's exactly what happened to Freya. Her parents didn't just reject her. They kicked her out of the house when she needed them most. It was a cold January night, and all she had was an old duffel bag, stuffed with whatever clothes she could grab, and a heart full of fear for the tiny life growing inside her. Fast forward 20 years later, those same parents show up at her doorstep, tears streaming down their faces, asking for forgiveness. But here's the question: can some wounds ever truly heal? And if so, where do you even begin? Freya's story starts like many others. A young girl falling in love, dreaming of a future filled with happiness and adventure. She met Owen during her sophomore year of high school. He was charming, confident, and seemed to understand her better than anyone else. Together, they talked about moving out, renting a small apartment somewhere exciting, maybe even starting a business together. To Freya, it felt like the beginning of something unstoppable. But dreams have a way of shattering when reality hits hard. After graduation, Owen changed. His ambitions grew bigger than their relationship, and one crisp October afternoon, he broke her heart by saying their love no longer fit into his plans. Little did Freya know, this was only the first blow in a series of events that would reshape her entire life. A few weeks after Owen left, Freya discovered she was pregnant. At first, denial clouded her thoughts, but the truth became undeniable when two pink lines stared back at her from a pregnancy test. With trembling hands, she mustered the courage to tell her parents, hoping for support, or at least understanding. Instead, she faced anger, disappointment, and rejection. Her father's voice still echoes in her mind. "You've made your bed. Lie in it." Those words cut deeper than any blade ever could. As Freya stood there, rooted to the spot, watching her dad storm off and her mum break down in sobs, she realized she had nowhere else to go. So she turned to the one person she knew wouldn't turn her away, her grandmother, Elena. Elena wasn't just a refuge. She became Freya's lifeline. In her little brick house with its sagging porch and winter roses peeking through the snow, Freya found a new kind of family. Elena taught her how to navigate motherhood, work odd jobs, and keep pushing forward despite the odds stacked against and her. When Sigd, Freya's son, was born, he brought light into their lives. Despite the hardships, Freya poured every ounce of love and strength she had into raising him. By the time Sigd turned 5, he was already showing signs of brilliance, asking endless questions about how things worked and why the world spun the way it did. Through it all, Freya clung to hope, determined to give her son a better life than the one she'd been handed. Years passed, and Freya built a life for herself and Sigd. She worked long hours at Rosie's diner, saving every penny she could spare, in a coffee can labeled Sig's future. Slowly but surely, she pieced together a stable existence. Then came Lance, a man as unexpected as he was persistent. Their meeting was anything but romantic. He walked into Rosie's wearing a suit that screamed money, while Freya spilled hot coffee all over him. Yet somehow, that awkward encounter blossomed into something real. Lance saw past Freya's sharp edges and fierce independence. He respected her boundaries and earned her trust, bit by bit. Eventually, he became part of their family, supporting Freya and Sigd in ways she never thought possible. But let's rewind to the moment everything shifted again, the day Paul and Ellen showed up unannounced. They looked older, worn down by regret and guilt. Tears streaked Ellen's face as she begged Freya to forgive them. Paul, once so stern and unyielding, now trembled as he admitted they'd made a terrible mistake. The sight of them stirred something deep within Freya, a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. How could they expect forgiveness after 2 decades of silence? And yet, standing beside her was Sigd, the living proof of the life she'd built without them. He watched the scene unfold with cautious curiosity, unsure of what to make of these strangers, claiming to be his grandparents. The tension in the room was palpable. Every word spoken carried the weight of years gone by. Elena, frail but fiery, confronted Paul and Ellen with a sharpness that left no room for excuses. "You left her to me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "and she built a good life anyway, a life you weren't part of." Freya sat rigid, her hand resting protectively on Sig's shoulder. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but she couldn't find the words. All she could do was stare at the steam curling from her untouched tea, wondering if forgiveness was even possible. As the conversation unfolded, one thing became clear. Paul and Ellen weren't just seeking forgiveness. They were desperate to reconnect with the family they'd abandoned. But Freya wasn't ready to let them back in. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too much pain that hadn't been addressed. And then there was Sigd. Caught in the middle of emotions he barely understood. Would he accept these strangers as his grandparents? Or would he side with the mother who sacrificed everything to raise him? Just as the confrontation reached its peak, Freya made a decision. She invited her parents inside for tea, but her tone was icy, her expression unreadable. It was a small gesture, but it opened the door, just slightly, to the possibility of reconciliation. As they settled into the living room, the air thick with unresolved tension, one question lingered in everyone's minds. What happens next? Will Freya find it in her heart to forgive her parents? Or will the scars of the past prove too deep to overcome? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this emotional journey, where secrets unravel, relationships are tested, and the true meaning of family comes into focus. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the weight of Elena's words pressing down on everyone. Freya's fingers tightened around her teacup, knuckles white, as she tried to steady herself. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to let out all the years of pain and anger that had been bottled up inside her. But instead, she sat there, frozen, staring at the steam curling off her untouched tea. Her parents' faces were etched with regret, their tears real, but not enough to undo what they'd done. Paul kept glancing at Sigd, his eyes flickering with a mix of pride and sorrow, while Ellen clutched her napkin like it was a lifeline. Sigd shifted uncomfortably beside Freya, his arm still wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He didn't understand why these strangers, his grandparents, looked so broken, why his mum seemed ready to shatter into pieces. All he knew was that this moment felt heavy, wrong somehow. "Mum," he whispered, leaning closer. "You okay?" His voice was soft, tentative, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Freya blinked, forcing herself to nod. "I'm fine, baby," she said, though her voice cracked on the last word. She reached up, covering his hand with hers, drawing strength from his presence. Lance watched silently from his spot near Elena, his jaw tight. He'd heard bits and pieces of Freya's story over the years, the betrayal, the rejection. But seeing it play out in front of him made it feel raw again. He glanced at Elena, who sat rigid in her chair, her cane resting against her leg like a weapon. She hadn't raised her voice much during the confrontation, but when she spoke, it carried the weight of decades. "You left her to me," Elena said, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "And she built a good life anyway. a life you weren't part of. Her gaze bore into Paul and Ellen, unflinching. So don't sit there crying now and expect forgiveness to come easy. Paul flinched, his hands trembling as he set his cup down too hard, spilling tea onto the saucer. "We know we messed up, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're here now. We want to make things right." Ellen nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Freya," she begged, reaching out a shaky hand. "Let us be a part of your life, of Sid's life. We've missed so much already." The desperation in her voice was palpable, but it only seemed to deepen the rift between them. Freya stared at her mother's outstretched hand, her chest tightening. How could she forgive them after everything? How could she trust them not to? Hurt her again? Sig looked back and forth between his mom and the strangers, confusion clouding his features. "Why did you leave her?" he blurted out suddenly, his voice louder than intended. The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Paul and Ellen froze, their faces pale. We didn't leave her," Paul stammered, running a hand through his thinning hair. We didn't know how to handle it. We were scared." Scared. The word echoed in Freya's mind, igniting a spark of anger she couldn't suppress. "Scared?" she shot back, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. "You were scared? Do you have any idea what it was? Like for me, alone, pregnant, kicked out of my own home. And for what? Because you couldn't face the neighbors. Because you couldn't deal with the shame." Ellen sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands, while Paul sank deeper into the couch, his shoulders slumped. "We were wrong, Freya," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "So wrong, but we can't change the past. All we can do is try to make amends." Freya clenched her jaw, fighting back tears. Part of her wanted to believe him, to give them a chance to prove they'd changed. But another part, the part that had spent 20 years building a life without them, wasn't ready to let them back in. Not yet, maybe not ever. As the argument simmered, Lance leaned forward slightly, breaking his silence. "Freya," he said gently, his tone measured. "This isn't about them. It's about you. What do you need right now?" His question caught her off guard, pulling her focus away from the chaos swirling around her. She took a deep breath, trying to clear her head. What did she need? Closure? Revenge? Or maybe just time to process everything that had happened tonight? She glanced at Sigd, who was watching her with wide, worried eyes, and then at Elena, whose expression was unreadable, but supportive. Whatever decision she made, it wouldn't just affect her. It would ripple through everyone she loved. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as Freya stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," she muttered, brushing past her parents without looking at them. Sigd started to follow, but Lance stopped him with a subtle shake of his head. "Give her a minute," he murmured. Sigd hesitated, torn between staying with his family and chasing after his mom. But eventually he nodded and sank back onto the couch, his fists clenched in frustration. Outside, the cold December air hit Freya like a slap, jolting her senses. She wrapped her arms around herself, pacing along the edge of the porch. The streetlights cast long shadows across the frost-covered lawn, and the distant hum of traffic provided a faint backdrop to her racing thoughts. Could she forgive her parents? Should she even try? They'd abandoned her when she needed them most, leaving her to navigate one of the hardest times of her life, completely alone. And yet, here they were now, begging for a second chance. Was it fair to hold their mistakes against them forever? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Pulling it out, she saw a text from Lance. "Take your time. We're here." The simple message brought an unexpected wave of relief, grounding her in the present. No matter what happened next, she wasn't alone anymore. She had Sigd, Elena, and Lance, a family she'd built herself, brick by brick. Taking a deep breath, she turned back toward the house, steeling herself for whatever came next. Whatever choice she made, she knew it wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers. The silence in the room felt suffocating, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Freya's words hung heavy in the air. "Sorry's a start, but it's not enough." Paul and Ellen sat frozen, their faces etched with shame and regret, while Sig shifted uncomfortably beside his mom, torn between anger and confusion. Lance glanced at Freya, his expression unreadable but supportive, waiting for her next move. Elena leaned back in her chair, her cane resting against her leg, like a sentinel, watching everything unfold with sharp eyes that had seen too much pain over the years. Freya took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "You left me," she said finally, her voice trembling but steady. "Not just once, but every day after that night. You didn't call, you didn't write, you didn't try to find me when I needed you most. And now you show up here crying, saying you're sorry. Like that fixes anything?" Her voice rose, raw with emotion, and Sigd instinctively reached out, placing a hand on her arm. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. Paul nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "You're right, Freya. It doesn't fix anything. We can't change what we did, or what we didn't do. But we're here now because we want to be better. For you, for Sigd." He gestured toward his grandson, his voice breaking. "We don't deserve a second chance, but we're asking for one anyway." Ellen chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've spent 20 years regretting our mistakes, Freya. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone we missed. It haunts us. We thought about reaching out so many times, but we were scared. Scared you'd hate us. Scared you wouldn't forgive us." She wiped her tears with a shaky hand, looking smaller than ever. "But seeing you now, seeing the life you've built, the son you've raised, we realized how much we lost, how much you lost, because of us." Sig looked between his grandparents and his mom, his brow furrowed. "So, what happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Do we just pretend this never happened?" "No," Freya said firmly, shaking her head. "We don't pretend anything. That's not how this works." She turned to Paul and Ellen, her gaze piercing. "If you really mean what you're saying, if you really want to make things right, you have to earn it. Trust isn't something you get handed. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice." Elena cleared her throat, leaning forward slightly. "And actions speak louder than words," she added, her tone as sharp as ever. "You two owe Freya more than apologies. You owe her proof that you've changed. Start small, be consistent, show up, not just today, but tomorrow, and the day after that. If you're serious about being part of this family again, then prove it." Paul and Ellen exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "We will," Paul promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever it takes." The rest of the evening unfolded in fits and starts, awkward conversations giving way to tentative smiles. Sig listened intently as Paul and Ellen shared stories about Freya's childhood. How she used to climb trees despite their warnings. How she once tried to bake a cake without following the recipe and ended up with something resembling cement. Slowly the ice began to thaw, though the scars remained visible beneath the surface. As the night wore on, Lance pulled Freya aside, his hand warm on her shoulder. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his blue eyes searching hers. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to believe them, to give them another shot. But the other part, it's hard to forget, you know? Hard to trust." He nodded, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You don't have to decide everything tonight. Take your time. Whatever you choose, I'll be here with you." By the time Paul and Ellen left, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. There was still tension, still unresolved questions, but there was also a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread that might, with care and effort, grow stronger over time. As they drove away, Ellen turned to Paul, her voice soft but resolute. "We'll make this right. For Freya, for Sigd, no matter how long it takes." Back inside, Freya stood by the window, watching their taillights disappear into the darkness. Sigd joined her, his presence a quiet comfort. "Mom," he said after a moment, "do you think they mean it? About wanting to change?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I think they do. But change isn't easy, and forgiveness isn't either. We'll take it one step at a time. Okay, together." Sigd smiled faintly, leaning his head against her shoulder. Together. In the days and weeks that followed, Paul and Ellen kept their promise. They visited regularly, always respectful of Freya's boundaries, always eager to learn more about the lives they'd missed. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild the bridges they'd burned all those years ago. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of frustration, flashes of old wounds, but it was progress. For Freya, forgiveness didn't come overnight. It came in small, incremental steps. Accepting a bouquet of flowers from Ellen, sharing a laugh with Paul over old memories, allowing herself to feel a flicker of warmth when they praised Sigd's achievements. Each act of kindness chipped away at the walls she'd built, until one day, she realized she no longer felt the need to guard her heart quite so fiercely. As for Sigd, he found himself growing curious about these strangers who claimed to be his grandparents. Over time, he learned to see them not as symbols of rejection, but as flawed humans trying to make amends. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Years later, sitting on the porch of the little brick house where it all began, Freya watched as Sigd played with his own children in the garden. Paul and Ellen were there too, laughing alongside Lance and Elena, their laughter blending with the hum of summer cicadas. Life had come full circle, weaving together threads of love, loss, and redemption into something beautiful. Freya leaned back in her chair, a contented smile tugging at her lips. She had fought hard for the life she'd built, and though the journey had been far from easy, she knew one thing for certain. Love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when it hurt, even when it scared you, and sometimes that was enough.